What happens when a tiny island the size of a city tells the most powerful nation on Earth to mind its own business? What happens when a country with no army, no oil, no farmland, and no rivers looks the United States straight in the eye and says, "We will do this our way"? Most people would call that crazy. Most economists would call it a death wish. But Singapore did exactly that. And what followed shocked the entire world. This is not just a story about economics. This is a story about pride, about vision, and about one small nation that refused to be told what it could and could not become. Singapore in the 1960s was a place that most of the world had already written off. Kicked out of Malaysia, surrounded by larger and sometimes hostile neighbors, and sitting on a tiny strip of land with almost nothing to offer. No resources, no safety net, no guarantees. But something remarkable happened. A group of leaders decided that their greatest resource was not under the ground. It was in the minds of their people. And from that belief, they built something the world had never seen before. By the time Singapore was done proving its point, it had one of the highest incomes per person on the entire planet. So how did they do it? And what exactly happened after they pushed back against America? Let us get into it. Point 1. The moment Singapore drew the line. Now, to understand why Singapore pushed back against America, you first have to understand the world that Singapore was born into. In 1965, Singapore was ejected from Malaysia in what its founding leader Kuan Yew described as a moment of anguish. This was not independence by choice, it was separation by force, and the new nation had almost nothing to stand on. No natural resources, a small and diverse population, racial tensions that threatened to boil over, and Cold War pressures swirling all around the region. America at the time had strong opinions about how developing nations in Southeast Asia should run themselves. The United States was deep in its Cold War mindset and wanted countries in the region to align tightly with its interests. It pushed for open markets on its terms, political arrangements that suited its strategy, and a general posture of dependence on Western goodwill. Kuan Yew had a very different idea. He looked at what America was offering and what it was demanding in return, and he made a calculated decision. Singapore would engage with America, it would trade with America, but it would not be dictated to by America. This was a bold move for a country that had only just come into existence, but Lee understood something crucial. Dependence on any single power, no matter how friendly, was a trap. True security meant building your own strength, and that conviction would shape every single policy that Singapore made from that day forward. Point 2. The man who refused to play by other people's rules. You cannot tell this story without understanding Kuan Yew. And once you understand him, you understand why Singapore went the direction it did. Lee was not a typical politician. He was trained as a lawyer in England. He was sharp, disciplined, and utterly relentless in his pursuit of results. He had no patience for corruption, no tolerance for inefficiency, and absolutely no interest in following a template that someone else had designed for a different country with different problems. When Western advisors came to Singapore with recommendations, Lee would listen. He would ask sharp questions. And then he would often do something entirely different, because he believed that Singapore had a unique context that required unique solutions. He famously said that he was not interested in theories. He was interested in what worked. This attitude put him in direct tension with Washington more than once. America preferred a certain kind of leader in the developing world, one who was democratic in the American style, open in the American economic sense, and generally agreeable to American interests. Lee was none of those things in a neat and comfortable way. He ran a tight government. He restricted certain freedoms. He built a state that was deeply involved in guiding the economy. American commentators criticized him. Western journalists wrote skeptical pieces about his methods. And Lee responded with characteristic bluntness. He told them to look at the results, not the theory. And the results, as the world would soon see, were extraordinary. Point 3. Building an economy from practically nothing. Here is where the story gets genuinely remarkable. Because when you have nothing, you have to be creative in ways that comfortable, resource-rich countries never have to be. Singapore in its early years had one thing going for it: location. It sat at one of the most important shipping lanes in the world, the Strait of Malacca, through which a huge portion of global trade passes every single day. Lee and his team decided to build everything around that single geographic advantage. They created one of the most efficient ports on the planet. They invested in infrastructure at a pace that was almost unheard of for a developing nation. They built a legal system that businesses could trust completely. They made corruption essentially non-existent in government, which was extremely rare in the region at the time. And they invited multinational companies to come and set up operations. Not because Singapore was weak and desperate, but because Singapore had made itself the most reliable, clean, and efficient place to do business in all of Southeast Asia. The results were stunning. Within just one generation, Singapore transformed from a poor, developing country into one of the wealthiest places on Earth. Its income per person surpassed that of many Western nations, including the United Kingdom, the country that had once colonized it. That last part carries a certain poetic weight that Lee Kuan Yew never failed to appreciate. Point 4. The housing revolution nobody talks about enough. One of the most quietly extraordinary things Singapore did was solve a problem that almost every other country in the world has failed to solve: housing. When Singapore became independent, a huge portion of its population lived in overcrowded, unhealthy slums. There was no clean water, there was no sanitation. There was poverty packed into tight spaces with no clear way out. The government looked at this situation and made a decision that Western economists would have found deeply uncomfortable. The state would build homes, not as charity, not as temporary relief, but as a permanent, high-quality national program that would eventually house more than 80% of the entire population. The Housing Development Board was created and given enormous resources and enormous authority. Within decades, the slums were gone, replaced by clean, modern, affordable apartments that Singaporeans could actually own. America and Western critics at the time were skeptical of this level of government involvement in the housing market. The free market, they argued, should handle this. But Lee looked at the free market and the slums that existed under it, and he chose results over ideology. Today, Singapore consistently ranks as one of the best-governed cities in the world, and its public housing program is studied by urban planners from every corner of the globe as a genuine model of what is possible when government actually commits to solving a problem, instead of just talking about it. Point 5. The education obsession that changed everything. If there is one investment that explains Singapore's miracle more than any other, it is education. And the story of how Singapore approached education tells you everything about what kind of country it was determined to become. From the very beginning, Lee Kuan Yew understood that in a country with no natural resources, the human mind was the only resource that mattered. So Singapore built schools, it trained teachers, it designed a curriculum that was relentlessly focused on science, mathematics, and practical skills that the global economy would actually reward. And it held everyone to a high standard, consistently and without apology. This was not always popular. The pressure on students in Singapore is real and intense. Parents know it, children feel it, and critics, including American educators, have pointed to the stress this system creates. But Singapore made a deliberate trade. It decided that a generation of well-prepared, highly skilled, globally competitive graduates was worth the pressure of a demanding education system. The outcomes speak for themselves. Singapore students consistently rank at the very top of international assessments in reading, mathematics, and science. Singaporean graduates are recruited by top companies and universities around the world. And the technical and engineering workforce that Singapore built from scratch became the foundation for attracting industries that transformed the country's economy, from manufacturing into high technology, finance, and biotechnology. A tiny island with no forests, no mines, and no oil fields somehow built a knowledge economy that the entire world envies. Point 6. When America pushed back hard. Now here is the part of the story where the tension really sharpens. Because as Singapore grew more successful and more confident, its disagreements with America became more public and more pointed. One of the most famous clashes came in 1994. A young American named Michael Fay was living in Singapore and was convicted of vandalism. He had spray-painted cars and stolen road signs. Under Singapore law, the punishment included caning. The American government was outraged. President Bill Clinton personally appealed to Singapore to spare Fay the caning. The American media exploded with coverage. Western voices condemned Singapore's legal system as brutal and backwards. Singapore listened politely to all of this. And then, Singapore caned Michael Fay anyway. Kuan Yew and the Singapore government made their position absolutely clear. Singapore had laws. Those laws applied to everyone equally, including American citizens. The fact that a powerful foreign government disagreed with those laws was irrelevant. Singapore was not going to bend its legal system to satisfy foreign pressure. The message was unmistakable. Singapore respected America as a partner and a trading ally, but it did not recognize America's right to tell it how to run its own country. That principle, consistent, firm, and unapologetic, had been at the heart of Singapore's identity from day one. And the Michael Fay case broadcast it to the entire world in a way that everyone understood. Point 7. The China Balancing Act. As Singapore grew, it found itself navigating one of the most delicate geopolitical tightropes imaginable. On one side was the United States, its largest trading partner for many years and the guarantor of regional security. On the other side was China, a rising giant with deep historical and cultural ties to a large portion of Singapore's population. America often pressured countries in Asia to choose a side, to declare their loyalty, to make clear whether they were in the Western camp or the Chinese camp. Singapore's response to this pressure was characteristically direct. No. Singapore's position was that it was a friend to everyone and a colony of no one. It would trade with China, it would trade with America. It would maintain military cooperation with Washington while keeping open economic ties with Beijing. It would say things that annoyed both sides when those things needed to be said. This made Singapore deeply useful as a neutral ground. Singapore hosted historic meetings that neither China nor America could easily host themselves. It became a place where deals could be discussed, where back-channel communication could happen, where the tensions of the wider world could sometimes find a quiet room. But it also required extraordinary diplomatic skill, because both America and China tested Singapore constantly. They applied pressure, they dangled incentives, they made veiled threats. And Singapore held its line, not because it was arrogant, but because it understood that the moment it became a satellite of any great power, it lost the thing that made it valuable to everyone. Point 8. The financial hub that rewrote Asia. One of Singapore's most breathtaking achievements is something that most people outside the world of finance do not fully appreciate. Singapore became the financial capital of Southeast Asia, and arguably one of the top 5 financial centers on the entire planet. This did not happen by accident. It happened because Singapore made a series of deliberate, smart, and sometimes controversial decisions about money, regulation, and banking that attracted the world's wealth to its shores. Singapore built a legal framework for banking and finance that was transparent, reliable, and extremely sophisticated. It trained a workforce in financial services that could compete with London and New York. It created favorable tax conditions that drew major banks, investment firms, and asset managers to set up regional headquarters in the city. And crucially, it maintained a currency and a financial system that the world genuinely trusted. Wealth from across Asia and eventually from across the globe flowed into Singapore. Billionaires from Indonesia, from China, from India, from Russia, from everywhere set up family offices and holding structures in the city. Not because they were hiding money, but because Singapore was simply the most trustworthy, efficient, and stable financial address in the region. This transformation meant that even as the global economy shifted and manufacturing moved around, Singapore remained indispensable. Money, unlike factories, does not move based on labor costs alone. It moves based on trust. And Singapore had built more trust than almost anywhere else on Earth. Point 9. What Singapore's model means for the rest of the world. By now, you might be wondering what all of this means beyond Singapore itself. Because Singapore is small. Its population is around 6 million people. It is a city, really, not a continent. Can its lessons actually travel? The answer is complicated, but it is also deeply important. What Singapore proved is that good governance is the single most powerful development tool in existence. Not natural resources, not foreign aid, not favorable geography, although Singapore did have that. What turned Singapore from a desperate new nation into one of the wealthiest places on Earth was the quality of its institutions, the honesty of its government, the long-term thinking of its leaders, and the discipline of its people. Countries that have tried to copy Singapore have often focused on the wrong things. They copy the clean streets and the efficient airport. They copy the economic zones and the tax incentives. But what they miss is the harder stuff, the decades of patient institution building, the genuine commitment to education, the refusal to tolerate corruption at any level, the willingness to make unpopular decisions because they were right in the long run. Singapore also proved something about sovereignty. It proved that a small country does not have to accept the terms that powerful countries try to impose on it. It can engage with the world on its own terms, as long as it brings real value to the table. And real value comes from doing the hard work that many governments avoid. Point 10. What happened after Singapore said no? So we come full circle. What actually happened after Singapore pushed back against America, drew its own lines, and refused to be a compliant little island in somebody else's grand strategy? Something that nobody predicted. America and Singapore became close partners anyway. Because here is the thing that great powers eventually learn, even if it takes them a while. They do not actually need subordinates. What they need is reliable, capable, trustworthy partners. And Singapore, precisely because it insisted on being its own country with its own standards and its own values, became one of the most reliable partners in the entire region. America maintains a significant military presence in Singapore today, with access to Singapore's ports and facilities. The two countries cooperate on counterterrorism, on cybersecurity, on economic agreements, on a wide range of issues. Singapore regularly participates in American-led exercises and works closely with Washington on regional security. But it does all of this as a partner, not as a subordinate. And that distinction matters enormously. When Singapore speaks, people listen, precisely because Singapore has never just said what powerful countries wanted to hear. It has always said what it believed to be true and what it believed was right.
The tiny island that was told it could not survive went on to become a model that the whole world studies. And America, the country it once pushed back against so firmly, ended up respecting it deeply for exactly that reason.
What a story. What an absolutely extraordinary story. Think about where we started. A tiny island, newly independent, with no resources, no army worth speaking of, no safety net, and no guarantees. Surrounded by larger neighbors, pressured by great powers, and written off by much of the world as an experiment that was unlikely to survive. And yet, here we are. Singapore stands today as one of the cleanest, safest, wealthiest, and most efficiently governed places anywhere on Earth. It did not get there by following someone else's script. It got there by believing in itself, by doing the hard work, by refusing to be defined by its limitations, and by holding firm to the belief that sovereignty is not just a word on a document. It is something you earn every single day through the choices you make. The lesson here is not that every country should do exactly what Singapore did. The lesson is that vision matters. Leadership matters. Honesty matters. Long-term thinking, the kind that is willing to make hard decisions today so that tomorrow can be better, matters more than almost anything else. Singapore told America, we do not need you on your terms. And then it went out and built something so impressive that America came back to the table with far more respect than it ever would have offered otherwise. There is something in that for all of us. If this story moved you, if it made you think, please hit the like button right now. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I would genuinely love to know which part of Singapore's story surprised you the most. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about nations, leaders, and moments that change the course of history, please subscribe to this channel. There is so much more to come, and you do not want to miss a single one.